You don't even know how to mop a floor correctly." Brianna Cole, the head of human resources at Grantwell Industries, tipped her cup and let the coffee run across the tile in front of Michael Grant, the new janitor. A moment later, Trevor Blake, an operations manager, walked over, emptied his own cup onto the same spot, and told Michael to go brew him another one. The office laughed. Michael didn't argue. He knelt down, wiped up every drop, and quietly memorized each face watching him. Nobody on that floor knew who he actually was. The numbers on Michael Grant's desk had been good for 11 straight quarters. And that was the first thing that bothered him. Grantwell Industries ran payroll systems, back-office administration, and corporate support services for half the mid-sized firms in Chicago. And the reports coming up to the 32nd floor described a company that was efficient, stable, and unusually content. Michael had built the business himself, starting with a 2-room office and a single payroll contract for a dental practice on the north side, and he had learned early that businesses did not usually feel that smooth from the inside. I was 39, and he had spent most of the last 4 years in negotiation rooms and airports rather than in his own hallways. That distance was what let him notice the pattern at all. The employee satisfaction surveys came back at 94% favorable. The formal complaint log for the previous 14 months contained 9 entries, all closed, all marked resolved within an average of 6 days. For a company with more than 400 employees, 9 complaints was not a sign of health. It was a sign that something was eating them before they reached him. The turnover data told a different story than the surveys did. Executives and account managers stayed. Below that line in building services, the mailroom night operations and entry-level administrative work people left at a rate that should have triggered alarms months earlier. Exit interviews existed for almost none of them. The ones that did exist were 3 sentences long and said the same thing in slightly different words. Personal reasons, relocation, better opportunity. Michael pulled the raw data himself on a Thursday night after the floor had emptied and matched departures against the managers those employees reported to. The clustering was obvious once he stopped looking at company-wide averages. Certain names appeared again and again at the top of the chain. He printed nothing. He sent nothing to legal. He sat in his office with the lights off and understood exactly how an internal investigation would play out. High would authorize an audit. Word would move through the building in under a day, because word always did. Files would be reorganized. Systems would be cleaned. People would be coached on what to say. By the time investigators sat down with the employees who had the most to tell, those employees would have already been reminded quietly and carefully that they had bills to pay. Michael had watched other companies do this to themselves. The paperwork would be flawless, and the truth would be gone. So he made a different decision, and he made it alone in that dark office, in less time than it took most people to choose a restaurant. The only person he brought into it was Margaret Hayes, his chief operating officer, a woman of 52 who had joined Grantwell when it was still operating above a print shop, and who had told him no more times than anyone else on the executive team. She listened to the plan without interrupting, then told him it was reckless, then told him she would handle the operations calendar and cover his absence with a story about an extended acquisition process on the West Coast. "You understand what you're going to see," Margaret said. "I'm counting on it," Michael answered. The rest was easier than it should have been. Michael had never been a public figure in his own building. He had no portrait in the lobby, no all-hands photographs, no habit of walking the floors. The company website carried a single headshot that was 6 years old, taken when he still wore his hair short and had not yet grown the beard. Most of the people who worked for him had never been in a room with him. To the mid-level and entry-level staff, he was a signature, and a name on a paycheck. He let the beard fill in for 3 weeks. He traded the tailored suits for a gray work uniform, with the sleeves already worn thin at the elbows. A pair of second-hand boots and glasses with heavy frames he did not need. Grantwell's building services crew were company employees on the company's own payroll, which was exactly why Michael wanted the job. But new placements came in through an outside staffing agency that handled applications and screening. Margaret routed him that way, which meant the internal human resources department never opened his file. Once the agency cleared him, he went onto Grantwell's system, like everyone else on the crew, with a badge, a locker, and a time card. On the first Monday, in March, a new janitor named Michael badged into the service entrance of Grantwell Industries at 5:40 in the morning, and nobody looked at him twice. He was not testing whether people would be polite to their chief executive. He already knew the answer to that. He was testing something a corner office had never once been able to show him. He wanted to see how the people who worked for him treated a man they were absolutely certain had no power at all. I did not have to wait long. The 11th floor housed human resources operations, support, and a wide-open work area with glass conference rooms along the east wall. Michael was assigned to it on his 3rd day, and by the end of the first hour, he had learned that the fastest way to become invisible in a building was to carry a mop through it. Conversations continued as he passed. Doors were held open for the person behind him and released before he reached them. 2 account coordinators discussed a colleague's medical leave in detail while he worked 6 feet away because it did not occur to either of them that he was a person who could hear. That was not cruelty. That was ordinary, and Michael filed it away as ordinary. Brianna Cole was different, and he understood that within a day of watching her. She ran human resources for the entire company. She was in her early 30s, and she moved through the floor the way weather moves through a field. People adjusted their posture when she approached. Conversations changed subject. She had a habit of stopping beside someone's desk and reading their screen without asking, and the person would sit very still until she walked away. On Thursday morning, Michael mopped the corridor outside the Human Resources suite, working from the far wall, back toward the elevators, the way the job is supposed to be done, so no one would have to cross wet tile. He had finished the last section, and the floor was clean and beginning to dry when Brianna came around the corner with a coffee cup in her hand and a colleague half a step behind her. She saw the wet floor sign. She saw him. She stepped directly into the section he had just finished, tilted her wrist, and let the coffee pour out onto the tile in a long, unbroken line that ran nearly to the baseboard. "You don't even know how to mop a floor correctly," she said, and the woman beside her laughed the way people laugh when they have decided in advance to agree. Michael looked at the floor, then at her, then back at the floor. Every instinct he had built over 17 years of business told him to answer. He had ended contracts worth $4 million over less. He set the mop against the wall. Wall took the towel from his cart, got down on one knee and started wiping up the coffee by hand because the mop would only spread it. Trevor Blake arrived while Michael was still on the floor. He managed operations support on that same 11th floor. He and Brianna ate lunch together most days, and he had the loud, easy confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone whose opinion he valued. He took in the scene, the kneeling janitor, and the brown streak across the tile, and Brianna standing over it with an empty cup, and he grinned. He did not tell her to stop. He walked to the exact spot Michael had just cleaned, held his own cup out at chest height, and turned it over. The coffee was hot enough that Michael felt it soak through the knee of his uniform. Trevor watched it spread with genuine enjoyment, and then looked down at the man cleaning it. "Since you're already down there," Trevor said. "Go get me another one. 2 sugars. The machine on this floor makes it weak, so use the one on 10. 19 people were in a position to see it happen, and Michael counted them. 4 of them laughed out loud, including the woman who had walked in with Brianna. 6 looked away with the particular speed of people who have decided that not seeing something is the same as it not happening. A young analyst near the printer stood up halfway out of his chair, then sat back down and returned his eyes to his monitor. The rest simply continued working, and their faces showed nothing at all, which told Michael more than the laughter did. Nobody said a word to Brianna. Nobody said a word to Trevor. Michael wiped the second spill, wrung the towel into the bucket, took the bucket down to 10, made the coffee with 2 sugars, carried it back up and set it on the corner of Trevor's desk without being thanked. Then he returned to the corridor and mopped the whole section a 3rd time, and he did it properly because he had learned in his 20s that the surest way to be dismissed is to do bad work while angry. He had come into the building expecting to find sloppy management, missed approvals, favoritism, the ordinary rot that collects in a company when leadership stops walking the floors. What he had just watched was not sloppiness. It was rehearsed. Brianna had not hesitated before, and Trevor had not hesitated before joining her, and neither of them had glanced around the room first to see who might be watching. People do not behave that way the first time. They behave that way after the 10th or 15th time, once they have confirmed there is no cost. And a floor full of witnesses had watched it happen without a sound. The problem Michael had come looking for was not hiding in the quarterly reports on his desk. It was happening in the middle of his own office floor, in daylight, in front of everyone. Margaret called him that night at 9 on a prepaid phone. He kept in his jacket, and he could hear from her first sentence that she had already heard about it. 2 people had emailed the operations mailbox to describe what happened on the 11th floor, and but the messages had been forwarded to human resources for handling, which meant both messages had gone to Brianna Cole. Margaret had pulled them before they moved any further. "You have it," she said. "It's documented. There are witnesses, and it's on camera in the corridor. I can open a formal investigation tomorrow morning, and both of them will be gone inside a week. Come home, Michael." I was sitting on the loading dock steps behind the building in the cold, with his uniform still stiff at the knee, and he thought about it seriously, because it was the correct answer to the question he had originally asked. Then he told her no. "If I walk in tomorrow," he said, "I fire 2 people and the company applauds. Everyone goes back to their desks feeling better. And in 14 months, I'm sitting in the same office wondering why the exit numbers still look like this." Margaret said nothing for a while on the other end of the line. Michael explained what he had been turning over since the afternoon. Brianna had poured coffee on the floor in front of the entire department without checking the room first. Trevor had escalated it and given orders in front of the same crowd. Neither of them had shown the smallest concern about consequences. That kind of confidence is not a personality trait. It is information. It means the 2 of them had already learned from experience that reports went nowhere, that witnesses stayed quiet, and that the machinery, which was supposed to protect employees, had been turned around to face the other direction. He did not want the 2 people. He wanted the thing that had made them so sure. "Somebody built that certainty," he said. "I want to know who, and I want to know how, and if I show my face now, every trace of it disappears in an afternoon." Margaret argued for another 10 minutes, because that was her job, and because she had never once let him do something dangerous without making him defend it out loud. Then she gave in on 2 conditions. She would keep a copy of everything he sent her outside the company systems, and he would tell her immediately if anyone began looking into who he was. Michael agreed to both, and then he went back to work. His method changed that week, and it changed the way a man's method changes when he stops observing and starts building a case. He carried a small notebook in the chest pocket of his uniform, and at the end of every shift, he wrote down times floors, names, and exactly what had been said without commentary. He recorded who had given an instruction and who had been present when it was given. He was careful never to write in the building where someone might see him. He learned the building's rhythm, the way only night staff ever learns it, which was the second thing the mop gave him. He knew which managers stayed past 7, which conference rooms got used for conversations that should have happened in offices, whose desks were covered in printouts that should not have been printed, and which departments left their screens unlocked. He was not searching anything yet. He was learning the shape of the place, and he watched something he had not planned to watch, which turned out to matter more than either Brianna or Trevor. He watched the ones who did nothing, the young analyst, who had half risen from his chair, the woman at the printer, who had turned her back, the 2 supervisors who had walked through the corridor while Michael was on his knees, seen it clearly, and kept walking without breaking stride. None of them had touched him. None of them had said a word to him. Michael wrote their names down anyway, in a separate column from the 4 who had laughed, and beside each one, he wrote what they had seen and what they had done about it, because a room full of silence is not an accident either. Somebody teaches a room to be silent. By the end of his second week, Michael Grant was no longer conducting a review of company culture. He was running a covert investigation inside a business he owned, and he was running it from the bottom of it, in a gray uniform with a mop in his hands and a notebook against his chest. The lower a man stands inside a system, the more of it he can see, and by his 3rd week, Michael had stopped being surprised by that. He learned it first from the time cards. The building services crew worked a shift that ended at 2 in the afternoon, but 3 or 4 of them were routinely asked to stay until 6 or 7 to handle conference room turnovers, executive floor requests, and whatever operations support decided needed doing. Nobody refused. When Michael compared what he had personally worked against what the system showed the following week, the extra hours were not there. His own record. Read 7.5 hours on a day he had worked 11, and the entry carried a modification stamp he had never made. He raised it once deliberately to see what would happen. The building services coordinator told him the system sometimes corrected itself for scheduling errors, and that he should let it go. When Michael asked who made the correction, the man looked at him for a long moment and said it was better not to ask that on the 11th floor. The shift differentials went the same way. There was supposed to be an additional $2.50 an hour for work after 6 in the evening written into the employment terms. Michael himself had approved 4 years earlier in a meeting that lasted less than an hour. On the floor, nobody had seen the differential in months. When one of the night crew had written to ask about it, the reply had come back from Human Resources, saying his position was classified in a way that made him ineligible, and that further inquiries would be treated as a policy compliance matter. Michael read that email over the man's shoulder in the break room and understood exactly what it was. It was not an answer. It was a warning, dressed as an answer, written by somebody who knew the reader would not have a lawyer. He found the same shape everywhere he looked once he knew to look. A woman in accounts processing had received a written performance warning. 8 days after she asked in a team meeting why overtime approvals had to route through operations support instead of her own manager. A mail clerk who had gone to Human Resources about a supervisor's language had been offered a transfer to a shift he could not physically work and had resigned within the month. The negative manager evaluations were the cleanest evidence of all, because Michael knew what they were supposed to look like. Grantwell's review system allowed employees to submit upward feedback that was meant to travel to the executive team unedited. What reached his office each year was bland to the point of uselessness. What he found on the floor in the ordinary conversation of people who assumed the janitor was furniture was that plenty of people had written plenty of things. They simply never heard about them again. And the ones who wrote the sharpest things tended to be gone within 2 quarters. Evelyn Parker was the first person in the building who treated him like a man instead of a function, and she had it in his 3rd week in a stairwell when nobody was watching. She had worked in human resources at Grantwell for 11 years, which made her the longest-serving person in that department by a wide margin, and she had watched 3 different heads of the department come and go above her. Michael had noticed her before she noticed him. She was the one who learned the names of the temporary staff. She was the one who carried her own dishes to the kitchen. She had been in a meeting on another floor on the morning of the coffee, and it had taken her some days to find him alone. "I want to say I'm sorry for what happened out there," she said, standing 2 steps above him on the landing with a folder held against her chest. "It shouldn't have happened, and I'm sorry that it did, and I'm sorry that I wasn't there." Michael told her it was not her fault, and meant it. "That isn't the same as it being all right," Evelyn said. Her voice dropped then, and she looked once at the door behind her before she went on. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to take it the way I mean it. Don't fight them. Not her. Not him. If you need this job, keep your head down and finish your shifts, and don't give them a reason. People who push back here don't win. They just stop being here." She went up the stairs before he could answer, and Michael stood on the landing with the cold coming through the metal railing, and felt something go through him that had nothing to do with anger. Evelyn Parker worked in human resources. She had spent 11 years inside the one department in the entire company whose function was to protect employees from exactly this. And her honest kindly meant advice to a man who had been humiliated on the floor was to accept it quietly, because the alternative was worse. Brianna Cole was the head of that department. The person an employee was supposed to run to was the person they were most afraid of. There was no door left. That was not a broken process. That was a closed loop. And it explained every clean number that had ever crossed his desk. What Evelyn said also told him something practical. If people had been pushing back then, complaints existed whatever the reports on the 32nd floor said. He went looking for them that night from a terminal in the building services office. He did not need special access. Every complaint filed through the internal portal generated an automatic submission receipt, and those receipts collected in a compliance log that carried no content at all. Only a case number, a date, and a status. Because it held nothing sensitive, nobody had ever restricted it. Because it held nothing readable, nobody upstairs had ever bothered to open it. What reached the executive committee each quarter was a curated summary assembled by hand in the department it was supposed to be reporting on. The log held 41 case numbers from the previous 14 months. 9 had ever appeared in the summary that reached the office of the chief executive. Somebody was standing between the 2 numbers, and Michael was going to find out who. The break came on a Wednesday night at 11:10 in the Human Resources suite on the 11th floor. Michael cleaned that suite twice a week after everyone had gone. On this particular night, the door of the file room had not latched, and on the table inside sat a banker's box with a printed label reading, "4th Quarter Case Review, Executive Packet," along with a stack of folders that had already been sorted into 2 piles. The packet had a routing slip on top. It should have gone up to the executive committee 11 days earlier, and it had not moved. He did not touch the piles. He photographed the routing slip, and then he read. The folders contained the missing complaints, or at least a portion of them. Wage disputes. 2 separate reports about Trevor Blake's conduct toward support staff filed 4 months apart by different people. A complaint about a supervisor in night operations demanding personal errands. Every single one had been closed. Every single one carried the same designation in the resolution field, the word resolved entered from the same account. What made Michael's hands go still was the interview log stapled inside each folder. It was blank. Not one of those employees had ever been contacted. There had been no investigation of any kind. Someone had opened the case, marked it closed, and generated a receipt that told the person who filed it their concern had been addressed. Hunt photographed 9 folders that night and left everything exactly as he had found it down to the angle of the routing slip. Then he sat in his truck in the parking structure and sent the images to Margaret from the prepaid phone, and neither of them slept much afterward. They worked it from both ends over the following week. Michael fed her case numbers, dates, and names from the floor. Margaret matched them against personnel actions, payroll ledgers, and access records that only an executive could pull. Neither of them expected what the overlay produced. Brianna Cole was not doing this alone. The pattern was consistent enough to be a procedure. A complaint would come in naming a manager. Within 72 hours, the complaint would be closed without an interview. Within 3 weeks, the employee who filed it would receive either a documented performance warning, a schedule change, or a reassignment, and the paperwork for that action would originate from operations support, which was Trevor Blake's department. Within 2 quarters, that employee would resign, and the exit record would say personal reasons. 2 other managers appeared in the chain often enough that their involvement was not coincidence. One of them approved every schedule change. The other signed off on the performance warnings without ever having supervised the people receiving them. Neither had touched a complaint themselves, which was the point. The work had been distributed so that no single signature looked strange on its own. That was the part that told Michael this had been designed. Cruelty is spontaneous. This had architecture. Then he gave Margaret the sentence that changed everything a second time, and he did not know he was doing it. He told her that the night crew had not received the shift differential in months. Margaret called him back 4 hours later, and her voice had changed. "I want you to understand something," she said. "I have looked at that budget line twice this year, and it is clean. The differential has been funded in full every month at the contracted rate. From where I sit, those people were paid. There is no discrepancy anywhere in my systems. The only place on earth this shows up is on the floor, from the mouth of somebody who never got the money." That was the moment the disguise stopped being theater and started being the case. Knowing where to look, Margaret followed the money downstream instead of upstream. The differential had left Grantwell every month and never reached a single pay stub. It moved into a line item labeled Operational Contingency Administered Inside Operations. Support and out again to a supplier called Halden Facility Consulting, approved 14 months earlier under a delegated authority threshold that kept it below executive review. Halden had invoiced Grantwell for 11 months. There was no scope of work on file. No deliverable had ever been logged. The invoices were flat monthly amounts, always just under the number that would have required a second signature. The same pattern showed in the overtime pool and in a wellness allowance that had been quietly discontinued at the floor level while continuing to be funded on paper. Michael read her summary twice in the dark of the parking structure and felt the story. He thought he was inside of turnover completely. He had come down here to find out why his people were being treated badly. He had expected arrogance, maybe a manager who needed removing a culture that had drifted while he was in airports. What he had actually found was that the humiliation was the surface of it. The contempt was not the crime. The contempt was what made the crime possible, because people who have been taught that complaining costs them their income do not complain when their money goes missing. Brianna and Trevor had not built a hostile floor for the pleasure of it. They had built a floor where nobody would ever look up. The coffee on the tile had never been about the coffee. The deeper Michael went, the more visible he became, and he understood that before Brianna did. She began with a feeling rather than a fact. The new janitor turned up too often, in places that had nothing to do with trash. I was in this corridor outside the file room. He was on the 11th floor at hours when the 11th floor did not need him. She had passed him twice in the executive elevator lobby, which was not on his route. There were smaller things that bothered her more. He had been humiliated in front of his entire department, and he had not flinched, had not muttered, had not complained to anyone afterward. In her experience, people either fought back or they broke a little, and this man had done neither. He had simply cleaned the floor and come back the next morning, and his speech was wrong. She noticed it in a hallway exchange about a delivery entrance when he told her the loading schedule had been restructured under the service agreement, rather than saying the truck came later now. Nobody who is worried about losing a $9 an hour job talks about restructured agreements. She pulled security first. She asked the desk to run badge history on his access card, and she instructed them to preserve the 11th floor camera footage for the previous month instead of letting it cycle, because she wanted a record of everywhere he had been. Then she went after his personnel file and hit the wall Margaret had built, because the original application sat with the staffing agency rather than in her system, and the agency's contact was slow returning her calls. That delay was the only thing standing between Michael and exposure, and both he and Margaret knew it would not hold long. Trevor took a different approach, which was to make the man react. He walked the length of a corridor Michael had just finished and emptied a wastebasket across it. It then stood there while Michael cleaned it up, telling an amused colleague that some people needed the practice. He sent him to scrub a stairwell that had been cleaned that morning, then sent him back a second time, saying it was not done right, and then a third time with 2 coordinators watching from the doorway. He had him carry 40 boxes of files from one storage room to another, and then, an hour later, carry them back. Michael did every one of them, and each time he felt what he had felt on his knees on the tile, and each time he put it down and picked the mop back up. He knew precisely what one sentence would buy him. He could end all of it in 6 words, and Trevor Blake's face would be worth remembering for the rest of his life. He also knew what it would cost. The moment his name was spoken in that building, the file room would empty, the Halden invoices would develop a scope of work, and the case log would be tidied by people who had 11 months of practice tidying things. He would be left holding an apology from 2 humiliated managers and no way to reach anyone above or beside them. So he stayed on the floor, and it was the hardest work he had ever done in his life, harder than any negotiation, because there was nothing to do with it except carry it. Then Margaret called on a Sunday night with the thing that took his time away. Brianna had submitted a workforce reduction proposal for execution in 9 days. It was framed as a cost realignment, 22 positions across support functions, and it had been built to look routine. Margaret had cross-checked every name. 16 of the 22 had filed a complaint, given negative upward feedback, or questioned a payroll discrepancy in the previous 18 months. 4 of them were in building services. 1 of them was Evelyn Parker. The list was not a budget measure. It was a cleanup, and once those people were gone, the witnesses would be scattered across the city, and the paper trail would belong to whoever stayed behind. Michael had days, not weeks. Brianna found him on Tuesday evening at 6:40 in the file room on the 11th floor. Michael had gone in for the internal transfer records on the Halden payments, which existed on paper in a single drawer and nowhere else, and there were 2 days left before 22 people were walked out of the building with their careers rewritten behind them. He had the drawer open and his phone in his hand when the overhead lights came on. She stood in the doorway with the security desk supervisor a step behind her, and she did not look surprised. She looked satisfied the way a person looks when a suspicion they have been carrying for 2 weeks finally puts on a body. "Confidential personnel files," Brianna said loud enough to carry into the corridor. "In a locked room after hours with a phone out. Call it." Trevor arrived within a minute because he had been waiting on the floor for it. And by then, a dozen people had come out of their offices to watch. Michael set the phone face down on the cabinet and said nothing at all. And that silence was the most expensive decision he had ever made. He had 6 words available to him. He could have ended it in the doorway, but the drawer in front of him was open and the transfer records were still inside it. And if he spoke his name in that room, that drawer would be empty by morning. And so would the file room, and so would the Halden folder. And every one of the 41 people who had filed a complaint would be left exactly where they had always been. So he let her have it. Brianna took her time. She told the assembled corridor that this was what happened when Ibiansi sent people without proper screening. She said the word theft twice. She said that some individuals apparently believed the rules did not apply to them, that she had suspected it from the first day, and that she was frankly relieved to be proven right. Then she pulled his badge off the lanyard hard enough to snap the clip, held it up so the corridor could see it, and dropped it on the floor at his feet. "You're terminated," she said. "Pick up your things and get out of this company." Trevor was grinning beside her. He waited until Michael bent down for the badge before he spoke because he wanted it that way. "Maybe next time," Trevor said, "learn how to mop a floor before you try being a hero." 2 security officers walked him down. Michael carried nothing but a jacket and a notebook in his chest pocket. Nobody in the lobby looked at him, except the young analyst, who had half risen from his chair on a Thursday 5 weeks earlier, and who now stood all the way up and did not sit back down. The glass doors opened onto Wacker Drive, and the phone in his jacket buzzed as he crossed the threshold. Margaret had sent 4 words. "We have the last piece." She had reached the Halden bank records through the Treasury side. The account had 2 signatories, and both of them had been standing in that file room doorway 10 minutes earlier. Michael turned around on the sidewalk and looked back through the glass at the Grantwell logo on the lobby wall, the one he had chosen himself in a print shop when the company was 9 people. He would be back in that building in 14 hours, not with a mop. The meeting for the Chicago headquarters staff was scheduled for 9 in the morning in the main conference hall on the 12th floor, and Brianna Cole arrived early because she intended to enjoy it. She had reason to. The problem had removed itself. The janitor was gone, escorted out in front of witnesses on record as a security incident, which meant nobody would ever check his file again. She had the workforce reduction proposal in a folder under her arm, 22 names ready to announce as a cost realignment, while the room was still absorbing last night's excitement. Trevor sat 2 seats down from her, leaning back, telling the story again to somebody who had already heard it. The room filled. Roughly 140 people. Department heads at the tables, everyone else along the walls. Evelyn Parker stood near the back, with her arms folded, and she had not spoken to anyone that morning. Brianna stood up and opened the folder. The double doors at the rear of the hall opened before she said a word. Margaret Hayes came in first, and behind her came 4 members of the board of directors, and behind them came the company's outside counsel, and none of them sat down. The room understood that something was wrong before it understood what. Then the last man came through the doors. He wore a dark suit and no glasses. The beard was gone, He walked up the center aisle without hurrying past the tables, past the department heads, and he sat down in the chair at the head of the long table, and the sound in the room stopped completely. Brianna's mouth was still open around the sentence she had been about to say. She knew the face and could not place it, and the not placing it was worse than recognition because some part of her had already done the arithmetic and was refusing to finish it. What she said next, she said out of pure reflex. "Security. Get him out of this room." Nobody moved. The two officers by the door looked at the board members and then at the floor. Margaret Hayes crossed to the front, set a bound file on the table, and spoke to the room rather than to Brianna, which was the cruelest way she could have done it. "Brianna," she said, "you have just ordered security to remove the chief executive officer of this company from his own meeting." The hall came apart in a low sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite anything else. Michael Grant stood up. I told them who he was in 3 sentences. Founder, chief executive, controlling shareholder of Grantwell Industries. He told them he had spent 5 weeks in the building in a gray uniform, badged in at 5:40 every morning, and that a great many of them had spoken freely in front of him because they had been certain he was nobody. He watched the recognition arrive on the faces along the wall, in stages the way a wave crosses a room. The man they had made kneel on the tile to wipe up coffee with a towel. The man Trevor Blake had sent to another floor to fetch a cup with 2 sugars. The man whose badge Brianna Cole had snapped off a lanyard and dropped on the floor 14 hours earlier. At the back of the hall, Evelyn Parker's arms came down to her sides. She was not looking at the suit. She was looking at a stairwell landing 3 weeks ago and hearing herself tell a frightened man to keep his head down. Trevor had gone, a color that did not belong on a living face. Brianna was still standing, holding the folder with 22 names in it, and she had not put it down because she had forgotten she was holding it. Then Michael did the thing nobody in the room expected, and he did it deliberately. He did not fire them for what they had done to him. "If I removed the 2 of you for humiliating me," he said, "that would be revenge, and every person in this room would be right to be afraid of me afterward. That is not what this is." He opened the file Margaret had set down and put 3 things on the table. The first was the compliance log. 41 complaints filed in 14 months, 9 of which had ever reached his office, and 9 folders whose interview pages were blank because not one of those employees had ever been contacted by a human being. The second was Halden Facility, consulting a supplier with 11 months of invoices, no scope of work, no deliverable, and no employees funded out of money. Grantwell had paid in full every month for the night crew's shift differential. He read the 2 names on the account and did not soften either of them. Brianna Cole, Trevor Blake. The third was the folder still in Brianna's hand, because Margaret had a copy of it. 22 positions. 16 of those people had filed a complaint, criticized a manager, or asked a question about their pay in the preceding 18 months. 4 worked in building services. 1 of them was standing at the back of the hall. "That is not a cost realignment," Michael said. "That is the removal of witnesses, and it was scheduled for Thursday." He closed the file. "There is one more thing you should know. Every frame of the 11th floor for the past month still exists because Brianna ordered it preserved. She was building a case against a janitor. She built ours instead." Trevor found his voice first, and what came out of it was not what he had used in the corridor. "She approved all of it," he said. "I moved paperwork. I signed what I was told to sign." Brianna did not turn to look at him. She said that everything she had done fell within her delegated authority, that the numbers had been approved, that the department had been given targets, and she had hit every one of them, and that no one on the 32nd floor had ever once asked her how. Michael let her finish. "That last part is true," he said. "That one is mine." Security escorted them both out of the hall, and this time nobody in the room laughed. The independent investigation ran for 11 weeks, conducted by an outside firm reporting directly to the board rather than to management. And Michael took no part in its findings because he had been a witness in it. Those directly involved in the falsification and the diversion were suspended and then separated according to the investigation's conclusions and the applicable legal process. And the Halden matter went to the authorities rather than being quietly settled inside the building, which cost Grantwell 3 unpleasant news cycles and was not negotiable. Every affected paycheck was audited going back 3 years. Withheld differentials, unpaid overtime, and the discontinued allowance were calculated with interest and repaid to 168 current and former employees, including people who had resigned 18 months earlier and had long since stopped expecting anything from Grantwell Industries. The complaint system was rebuilt so that no single human resources manager could close, edit, or delete a case on their own authority. Every filing generated a permanent record visible to the board. Every closure required a documented interview with the person who had filed it, and cases that sat untouched escalated automatically instead of quietly aging out. An independent reporting channel was established outside the management chain entirely so that an employee at the bottom of the building could report misconduct without the report passing through the hands of the person it concerned. Michael made 2 more decisions, and the board argued with him about both. The 4 employees who had laughed out loud in the corridor received documented findings in their files and were required to complete the conduct process, like anyone else, because laughing at a man on his knees is a thing a person chooses to do. The rest he left alone. I had their names. He had written them down himself and carried the notebook for 5 weeks. He understood by then what it actually recorded. Those people had not been cruel. They had been employed inside a system that had taught them correctly that speaking up would cost them their income, and that the department they were supposed to report to was the one they needed protection from. A room does not learn to be silent on its own. Somebody teaches it. So he changed the thing that had frightened them, instead of punishing them for having been frightened. Evelyn Parker, who had stopped a powerless man in a stairwell to apologize for something she had not done, was asked to help rebuild the department. She took the role only after Michael agreed that every position in it, including hers, would be filled through open and documented evaluation. He kept the gray uniform. It hung in the corner of the office on the 32nd floor, laundered the worn elbows still worn, and beside it on the shelf sat the coffee cup that had started all of it. 4 months later, Michael was crossing the 11th floor when someone knocked over a drink near the printers in almost exactly the place where Brianna Cole had once tipped her cup onto clean tile. A janitor, 2 doors down, set down his cart and started over. A young manager got there first. He crouched, pulled the towel out of his own bag, and said it was his spill and he would take care of it. Michael watched from the far end of the corridor and did not interrupt. Nobody had been mocked. Nobody had been ordered. Nobody had gone down onto the floor because another person wanted to demonstrate what they could make happen. I had spent 17 years believing a chief executive could understand a company through reports, margins, and meetings held on the highest floor of the building. The mop had taught him the one thing the chair never had. The culture of an organization is not what people show the chief executive when they know who he is. It is how they treat the man with the bucket when they are certain he is nobody at all. Power does not create a person's character. It only reveals the character that was already on there. No one should be measured or diminished by a uniform, a title, or the work they do to get through the week. A good workplace is not one where people are decent to their superiors out of fear of consequences. It is one where respect is extended to everybody, including when no one important is standing there to see it.